for Thursday, February 21st, 2013. And just a reminder that it is a public meeting this evening, and we are webcast as well as on Metro Television. And welcome. So our first item on the agenda is to get approval of the minutes from both 4:18 and 4:25, which are included in our table packets. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to review them. Otherwise, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I'd move to approve the minutes.
I'll second the motion.
Great, thank you. Any discussion? Okay, minutes are approved. Thank you.
We vote on it.
Oh, yes. The minutes are not approved. We are now voting.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, all those in favor of approving the minutes? Aye. All opposed? Great, thank you. Now, the minutes are approved. So, it is now time for our public comment. Public comment is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on the draft capital improvement program for fiscal years 2014 through 2019. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person and maybe less, depending on the number of people wishing to comment. Budget Committee members may ask clarifying questions of those testifying and will be given an opportunity to comment on what they've heard from the public at the end of the public comment time. Do we have any public comment requests?
No.
We do not. Okay. All right.
It's all staff.
Okay. In the absence of any public comments, I guess we will move straight to staff presentation on the draft fiscal year 14-19 CIP.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Pavel Gubanikin. I'm a budget analyst with the City of Eugene Finance Division, and tonight it is our pleasure to present for your consideration a draft capital improvement program that covers a 6-year period from fiscal year 2014 through fiscal year 2019. Before we start talking about specific projects included in the capital improvement program or the CIP, I would like to provide a brief overview of the purpose of this document and how the city has been using it for capital planning purposes. CIP has 3 primary goals. The main one is to provide a program for capital improvements for the next 6-year period based on a variety of plans that are adopted by the city, input from various stakeholders who have interest in city capital projects, and based on the funding that the city staff anticipate to have available for capital projects over the next 6-year period. We also use the CIP to document our unmet capital needs. In looking through this document, you will notice that quite a few projects here are identified as not being funded. However, we do include them in the CIP so we know what those unmet capital needs are in the event that if a grant opportunity or other funding sources may become available over the next 6-year period, that those projects are on the radar and that the city organization is aware of what those capital needs are. And finally, the CIP, once it's reviewed and possibly modified by the Budget Committee and the City Council, becomes the basis for the capital budget for the next 2 fiscal years. So when we bring for your consideration the proposed budget for fiscal year 2014, the capital section of that budget will be based on the CIP that the Budget Committee and the City Council will have approved by then. As I mentioned, the CIP projects really come from a great variety of sources. And those really are not limited just to city plans and policies. Some of the projects can be driven by direction from the City Council, and there are some projects such as the City Hall that are included in the CIP that are driven by those. There is also a great number of projects that are driven by external grant funding opportunities, requests from the publics. There are some that are also driven by external mandates that are imposed upon the city by other levels of government. So the CIP sort of summarizes all of this various information and presents it as a single document. Now, the projects that are included in the CIP generally fall into sort of 3 categories in terms of the funding that's available or not available for them. Funding secured category are projects where the funding is pretty much guaranteed to be available. For example, the transportation bonds that were approved by the citizens in the fall of 2012 would be an example of a secured funding source because it's sort of pretty much guaranteed to happen. So those are considered to be projects with funding secured. Funding identified are projects where there is a fairly high probability of funding for the project being available, but we do not exactly know whether that funding would materialize. For example, throughout the CIP, you will see projects funded by system development charges. Those would be an example of funding identified. We know we're going to get some SDCs over the next 6-year period. It's maybe hard to forecast exactly how much, since that will be driven by the development activities over this period of time. And finally, there are projects that for which truly no funding source has been identified, and those are projects with funding not identified. So to give an overview of the amount of projects that are funded, there's about $177 million. Again, that's over the 6-year period where funding was either secured or identified. There's also $153 million of projects with funding not identified. And, of course, the CIP also contains a discussion of the city's debt capacity and the possibilities of funding those projects. But, of course, it would not be prudent to utilize all of the available debt capacity to fund these projects because of, that would not be financially prudent, and the financial impact would be significant. So between those three categories, it totals about $330 million over the 6-year period. Now, the next slide is really busy, but what it attempts to demonstrate is that the funding for capital projects comes from great variety of sources, and the vast majority of those sources are fairly restricted to very specific uses. For example, federal aviation grants that are used for various airport capital projects, really those funds cannot be diverted for a different purpose. The same would apply for, for example, the passenger facility charges at the airport as well. Street bonds, another example where, by bond covenants, and, those are very restricted funding sources. The only category that's, can be considered sort of unrestricted is the general capital outlay, which is the $23 million slice. That's about 13%, give or take, of all funded CIP projects. And the primary revenue source for the general capital outlay fund is a transfer from the city's general fund. And for the most part, the only use of that transfer is the capital preservation projects for public buildings, facilities, and parks. Generally, these are the types of projects for which no other funding source is available. So I guess the takeaway from here is most of this money is restricted to a particular use. That's also the reason why you do not really see sort of a CIP-wide prioritization of projects. It's really not possible because much of this money comes with strings attached. Now, functionally, the projects in the CIP are broken down into these 6 categories, and the staff from Public Works and Central Services departments will go over some of those larger projects in greater detail. As far as how the funded projects are broken down by this category, you can see that traditionally transportation and the airport are the 2 largest segments of the CIP, and almost all of the transportation slice is the pavement preservation program. So those are really, the larger portions of the funded projects. Now, a little bit about the next steps in the CIP process. Generally speaking, the city staff put together a draft CIP every other year, and it was put together in the late fall and early winter. In late January, we did publish the CIP on our website and made efforts to reach out to various community groups, mostly through city newsletters to sort of cut down on the costs. But we do try to inform community members who might have an interest in the CIP projects to let them know what is being proposed so that folks can provide their input. And this meeting, as well as the City Council public hearing on the CIP, which is the next step, and that's the one that's scheduled for next Monday, February 25th, those are the opportunities for members of the public to provide their input. And once the CIP adopted, it becomes the basis for next year capital budget that will be brought to the Budget Committee in May. And at this point, Matt Rodriguez, the acting city engineer, will provide an overview of the public works section of the capital improvement program.
Good evening. As Pavel said, I will start with the public works portion of the CIP, which is airport, parks and open space, stormwater, transportation, and wastewater. So a little bit about the picture. That's a project we did at the south ramp last year at the airport, which was reconstruction and rehab of pavements. Let's see. Get this clicker going. So this slide shows total revenue employments per year from 2002. This is a pretty illustrative slide, and it shows that we have a sizable uptick in employments over the past few years, which is notable given the economic climate. One other thing that you may have heard, we also brought on a new airline here, Frontier Airlines, that will start service in May to Denver seasonally. So lots of good things happening at the airport. As far as funding, predominant funding is FAA grants, also known as Airport Improvement Program funds, passenger facility charges, airport construction funds, which are revenue from parking, concessions, things like that, and customer facility charges, which come from per-a-day rental car revenue. Relevant planning documents for the airport are the 2006 Airport Master Plan Update and the 5-year FAA CIP. The general character of the projects in the airport CIP are focused around expansion for those employments that continue to go up, as well as preservation of the pavements out there. There's a lot of pavement to maintain, and that's kind of a never-ending job. Some specific projects are the terminal building roof replacement. It's one of many phases of roof replacement we're doing out there, as well as a major terminal expansion and some taxiway rehab. And there are no unfunded needs shown in the CIP for the airport. This is just a photo of some Ridgeline Trail. The next one here for parks and open space is Creekside Park. You're probably familiar with that. We completed construction at Creekside Park in late January, and if you haven't been out there, it's a very nice facility. My kids definitely enjoyed it. Parks and Open Space has just under $10 million in the CIP period in funding, predominantly park systems development charges and general fund capital projects, also small portions of stormwater utility capital, parks maintenance, and Hayes Trust funds. Relevant planning documents are the 2006 Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Project and Priority Plan. And the character of the parks projects is really emphasizes site renovation and safety improvements at existing developed parks, as well as acquisition of property for new park sites. Development of new parks is pushed out in the CIP due to the concern over O&M funding to support new infrastructure. And when we come to the next CIP round, we'll reconsider where we are with that funding and where those projects are in the CIP. Major unfunded needs for parks are in site renovation and rehab predominantly. Stormwater, photo's a little hard to see, but this is actually a pretty large swale that we constructed in Ferndale Park as part of one of the dry well elimination projects that was constructed last summer. I'll talk probably a little bit more in depth later about the dry well elimination program, but basically we were able to remove the dry wells in this area, pipe the water to this constructed swale in the park, which provides water quality through vegetation and infiltration, also destination for a large amount of the water, and then anything that is in excess of the ability of that facility to infiltrate overflows to a nearby creek. Funding for stormwater is predominantly stormwater utility funds, with a small portion of stormwater SDCs and wetland mitigation bank funds. Relevant planning documents are the comprehensive stormwater management plan, the stormwater basin master plans for the city, and then regulatory documents for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System stormwater permit, as well as the Water Pollution Control Facilities UIC permit, which is really the dry well permit that we have. The projects focus primarily on general rehabilitation of the existing system, stream bank stabilization, and then the dry well elimination program. So a little bit more background on that one. Last time we came before the Budget Committee for the CIP, for the 12 to 17 CIP, we felt a permit was really imminent at that time based on where DEQ was in that process. Fast forward to this January when we actually received the permit, their perspective on the effect of dry wells on water quality significantly changed. And instead of it just being you have to have so many feet of separation between the bottom of a dry well and groundwater, it's now about groundwater protectiveness modeling, which is how far a pollutant basically travels from a facility, and then looking at how close that is to a drinking water source, and then you make a determination of whether or not it's a problem. We're in the middle of doing our groundwater protectiveness modeling to see what effect that'll have on required elimination. We're also looking at maintenance issues with dry wells. Many of them are maintenance issues for flooding and aren't easily cleaned. So regardless of the outcome of the groundwater protectiveness modeling, we will have dry well elimination. So we've left dry well elimination at the current funding level of $1 million a year, predominantly because the projects we have identified for the first 2 years of the CIP are high priority projects that would need to be done because of they're very close to drinking water sources, and we feel that the modeling will show that they need to be removed, and they're also flooding and maintenance problems. Transportation. The photo you see here is Jefferson Street. That was a local gas tax funded project we constructed this last summer. Notable because we used a process called in-place recycling, where you basically take the existing rock and soil, mix it with cement and water, and then you're able to create a new stable base to pave on. You eliminate all the truck trips and removing material and bringing back new rock, and that eliminate that need for virgin materials. Also, it's kind of hard to see, but one of the features here is you don't see smoke coming off the asphalt, and that's because we use something called warm mix asphalt and have since 2009, which basically eliminates the smoke emissions from asphalt paving. Another picture here is 13th Avenue and Alder Street. There's a combination of a pavement preservation program project, local gas tax funded, and a 2008 bond measure project, and we had some state bike ped money to do a reconfiguration of how that street works, and we won a Sustainable Transportation Project Award from Oregon APWA for this project. Funding, we have just under $70 million of funding. As Pavel mentioned, it's predominantly from the 2012 transportation bond. We also have the last, or really kind of a partial year of 2008 transportation bond funding, local gas tax funding, which is shown as pavement preservation capital, very small portion of general capital projects, which is the neighborhood livability funding, and SDCs, as well as stormwater and wastewater utility. That's shown here, and really what that represents is funding that we use to do repairs on streets to the wastewater and stormwater system before we repave them, just to make sure we don't have to come back and cut that pavement later, which we definitely don't want to do. We also do a high level of coordination with utilities to make sure that same thing doesn't happen there. Major planning documents for transportation are the Transportation System Plan, Pedestrian Bicycle Master Plan, 2035 Regional Transportation Plan. And we have unfunded needs. Even though we have substantial funding for pavement preservation, we do still have substantial unfunded need for pavement preservation. We're still looking to target somewhere around that $18 million level to really aggressively address the backlog. Wastewater, the photo you see here is showing what's called a cured in place liner that you basically blow into an existing pipe, and you add steam, it inflates that liner and basically creates a new internal pipe. Our work in wastewater is really focused around elimination of inflow and infiltration, and we've done a lot of that work in what I would term the easy areas of town so far in the street right of way. This picture just kind of illustrates that we're working in a lot of back lot lines now, And even though it's hard to access those areas, we actually have been very successful with doing that with minimal impact on property owners. Funding for wastewater is predominantly wastewater utility funds and then wastewater SDCs. Again, the program is really built around doing rehab work, also some pump station rehab work we do as part of that area, and we do have an unfunded need for wastewater rehabilitation as well. That's all for me. Moving on to facilities.
Good evening, I'm Mike Penwell. I'm the Design and Construction Manager from Facilities. Pleased to be here this evening. I'll talk about public buildings and facilities. Most of the work under the heading of public buildings and facilities is done through the facilities division, and most of our bread and butter work is things like re-roofs and plumbing systems and just basically taking care of buildings and facilities, swimming pools, that sort of thing, and keeping them up to date through major capital reinvestment over time to keep the facilities in good working order for delivering services to the community. I've started with the slide of the police headquarters because we also do major capital projects. We manage the design and construction of new buildings, major remodels such as the police headquarters, fire stations, things of that nature. Another thing that we get to be involved in are some energy efficiency projects, and we've really turned our attention to these quite a bit in recent years as a means of keeping up not only with the infrastructure but also trying to reduce the city's ongoing costs, especially around energy. And so we try to leverage other funds when we do that, and the steam conversion projects were a good example as EWEB was getting to the point of turning off the steam to the system in over a 5-year or so phase out. About the same time, the economic stimulus funds came available a few years ago, and so we leveraged some energy efficiency block grant funds to do some projects that we had to do anyway, but we made the money go further by combining it with federal funds. And this is a good example of how we not only deal with general funds with the Halt Center, but also the atrium with the atrium fund and the parking garages, and so we provide expertise to the rest of the organization as well as taking care of the general fund facilities directly. This is an example of some of the new equipment that went into the Halt Center. Because we used steam before, we didn't have boilers, and so we installed new boilers. These are high efficiency condensing boilers, and then we also got some rebates back from Energy Trust of Oregon for efficient equipment. And so again, trying to make the money go a little farther and being able to reduce costs for the city. This is a before and after snapshot of energy costs with the facilities that were involved with the steam conversion. The blue is showing the pre-project costs of energy over the course of a year, and the red shows the savings after the project was completed. So pretty substantial savings over time. Another example is some work we did at the pools, at Sheldon Pool and Echo Hollow Pool. Did some energy upgrades, and in that case we partnered with the Energy Trust of Oregon to provide some funding because our pools are the biggest users of natural gas that we have in the city. And so looking at ways to cut natural gas usage is beneficial. That's part of what the Energy Trust of Oregon does, and of course it's beneficial to us in terms of cost savings. So we looked at a variety of energy upgrade measures. We upgraded the lighting, both overhead lighting with high efficiency fluorescent and underwater lighting with LED lighting, actually. Ventilation improvements, because a big part of a pool, an indoor pool, is air changes to get rid of the chemicals, but you want to capture all that heat, and that you don't want to ventilate more than you have to. But when you do ventilate, you want to capture the heat and bring it back into the building. Automatic pool blankets was a great example of an opportunity that not only helped save money, but it also helped Larks to save money on their lifeguards, because it used to take 2 lifeguards a half an hour to roll out the manual blankets, and now with the push of a button with one finger, in about 2 minutes the blankets deploy. Not only are they much more likely to use them when all they have to do is press a button, but it also saves them money, not having to have 2 staff people for a half an hour rolling these things out, so that facilities benefits with our energy bills. So it's a win-win for both. And the retro commissioning digital controls, that just means fine-tuning the controls, utilizing computerized controls so that we're not overheating or underheating. We're just getting things to just the right place. And then the solar hot water heating system at Sheldon was in need of refurbishment, and so that was very cost-effective to include in this project as well. So again, this shows the before and after energy performance, the blue being the cost of energy before and the red after. So again, very substantial energy savings as a result of this project. And a lot of it was to upgrade equipment that was getting close to needing upgrading anyway. So our philosophy is try to accomplish more than one thing at any given time. So we always have a 2-fer or 3-fer whenever we do a project. And by doing that, we've actually been able to hold the line on facility rates back to the rest of the organization, and even reduce them over the past several years, because we've been able to reduce energy costs over the past 5 years plus. Actually, the program's gone back at least 15 years, but some significant projects in recent years. Another big one on the horizon, of course, is City Hall. Just had the pre-proposal meeting today with about 40 or 50 interested consultants who are excited about this project. So a lot of interest in it, and it's a very exciting project, a legacy project for the city, and hopefully a legacy project for the design team too. I hope they feel as importantly about it as we do. So that is a project that'll take the next 2 to 2.5 years to complete for design and construction. And so hopefully be moving in about the middle of 2015. Then I put the Halt Center up here as just a good example of a building. What happens as it ages when it reaches that 20 to 25 year period. The systems begin to fail. It begins to need a lot of upgrading. In the past 5 to 7 years, we've put several $1 million into the Halt Center through capital costs. And again, always trying to do some 2-fers or 3-fers. So as the dimming system, for example, it used to be a room almost half as big as this room with old coil dimmers and so on. It's all now digital dimmer equipment, and saves quite a bit of energy, takes up less space. And so any time it's getting close to upgrading something, we put the highest efficiency in. We go for rebates from EWEB and from Energy Trust of Oregon, and do the best job we can. So we've replaced much of the mechanical systems in the Halt Center over the last 5 to 7 years, replaced roofs, redone the lighting in the lobby just recently. If you've been there in the past 6 months or so, the new lighting, a lot of it's LED and high efficiency. Very beautiful, but also very energy efficient. And the library just passed 10 years of age, and so we're starting to put some money into the library. And when we build new, we think, oh, we're not going to spend any money for a long time, but eventually they start to age, and systems need work, and so we have to start doing the upkeep. This is just a breakdown of the overall funding. As Pavel explained earlier, the general capital projects makes the vast majority of this part of the budget. The facilities replacement fund over there at $8.7 million is the piece that the council started putting aside 12 years or so ago to help deal with City Hall, and that's largely the funding mechanism for moving forward with City Hall. And then there's some other little pieces that are tangential. One thing I wanted to point out about this in the CIP document, the $20.92 million is shown as if it's completely funded, but as people have been around for a while know, there's a $900,000 year-end component out of the marginal beginning working capital that is partial funding that has to be approved each year. So even though it's shown as approved in the budget document, there is still a process each year to make sure that that money is available and that it's a priority to move it into capital budget. So I'm always an advocate for moving it over into the regular budget, but you have to balance that with all the other needs around the city. And this is what I like to show, just to show how we're doing in relation to recommended funding levels. The red represents 2% of the replacement value for all of our facilities, and sort of an industry standard is 2 to 4% reinvestment based on the replacement value of the overall inventory. 4% would represent if our facilities were in bad shape and we wanted to sort of catch up. 2% is sort of a hold steady. You can see here from the blue that our funding level is actually behind that 2% replacement value level. We've been able to make that work out and in fact make some progress with existing deficiencies, primarily because we've not done major reinvestment in City Hall, and that's half of our deficiencies, and so it's been a little artificially skewed as a result of that. And now with our City Hall project, presumably we'll take care of all those deficiencies and have a like new building, or mostly new building. And then the other piece too is that periodically we build new facilities as well, and that's one of the strategies to make progress. And so we've had some bond measures to replace a few fire stations. We use facility reserve money to do the property and forensics building for police back in 2004 or 5. And so through a variety of mechanisms, we're able to build new facilities from time to time, and of course the library being the most major one 10 years ago now. But at some point, as I said before, you have to start taking care of the facilities and start putting some money into them. So it's kind of a long-range issue to think about as hopefully the economy improves and the revenues improve, that we will need to think about how to fund our facilities over time as well. That's it. So I'll turn it back over to Pavel for questions and next steps.
Are you coming back up, Pavel? Okay, you don't have to. No, that's fine. So, no, we will do. First of all, I just want to thank the city staff for their work to put this together and for their time to come to present to us tonight. It's very helpful. So now I'd like to open it up for questions. Are our timers on? Yes? Okay, great. So, Councillor Brown, you are first.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I've got a question. On page 2, there's the 3 categories: funding secured, funding identified but not yet secured, and then there's funding not identified for projects totaling $152 million. I'm just wondering what those projects are. I mean, we don't need to see a complete list, but maybe it would be interesting to know what those projects that we think we need to do are, and what the amounts are for each one, and that would total $152 million.
Here comes Pavel.
It's just more for curiosity. I mean, I realize they're not going to be built anytime soon, but I'd just like to know what.
Thank you.
I'd just like to know what's.
Pavel, before you answer, I'd just like to make sure everybody knows that unfortunately tonight, I guess some of the microphones may or may not be working 100%, so yeah, so let's make sure that please speak, let us know if you can't hear us, and we may need to share a couple microphones. So thank you.
And I'm sorry, I did have a little bit of a hard time hearing it in the back, but is the question what's included in the $153 million of unfunded projects? Yeah, basically within the 6 functional areas of the CIP, airport, parks and open space and so forth, there is, projects that are listed first, the projects that are funded, and then the projects that are listed in the second half of each section are projects that are unfunded. So it's probably a few dozen projects that fall into this category. Airport is really the only category that doesn't have any projects that fall into this category. Every other one does. So, to use an example, it's a great variety of projects across all areas. So, for example, an example would be new fleet facility, and public works would be, a large, facility that really doesn't have funding. So, and there is a number of others, like unfunded portion of the pavement preservation backlog and so forth.
Well, I just think it'd be useful if we could see a list with the. I just think it'd be useful just if we could
Point of
just
information?
see a list of and how it breaks out.
Right, actually in the financial summary
Then we could
section.
see the big picture of like, well, these are the things we know we're going to do. These are things we'd like to do if we have the funding. But I just think it'd be helpful if we could see.
Right, on page 32 in the financial summary section, there is that list. And we do have extra copies of the CIP
okay.
document if anybody lacks one, but they are listed
Okay.
separately, just the unfunded projects
I
in
haven't-
that section.
That's my fault. I haven't studied it closely yet.
It's 200
So-
pages. Yeah, it's
Okay.
easy to miss.
Okay. And then my other question, I think Mike Penwell answered it. It was the facilities replacement fund of 8.7. That's pretty much, that's like dedicated for City Hall, the new City Hall, pretty much.
Right, it hasn't formally been moved over and dedicated, but that's what we've talked about as
But
being the
everyone's-
primary funding
okay.
source, yeah. And
Okay.
that's what it was put aside, was to deal with City Hall.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I thought it was, and I think you answered that before I even had to ask my question. Thanks. And my last one is just a point of curiosity. You were talking about dry wells, and you stated that some of the dry wells are near drinking water sources. I was just curious which ones that would be.
Well, predominantly our dry wells are in the River Road, Santa Clara area. We have some in the Willackenzie area as well. And what's defined as near is 500 feet, basically, per the permit. So they're scattered. It's not the majority of them, but we do have a number that are within 500 feet that make them a higher priority, and likely with the groundwater protectiveness modeling will become a higher priority for having removal.
So these would be drinking water sources out in the county where, say, somebody has a well in their backyard and they're not hooked up to eWeb and they depend on that.
Actually, it's irregardless if they're hooked up to eWeb. There could be wells that people aren't using, but they're mapped wells. They don't have to be ones that are actually actively in use to be considered.
Okay.
Matt, you might, for the listening audience, just define what a dry well is, and everybody might not know what that is.
So a dry well is basically a facility. It's also, you could call it a French drain or something like that. But basically, you dig a hole, you fill it with rock, and you take a pipe to it, and water goes in. It goes into the open area around the rock, and then it stores it, and then it slowly infiltrates into the soil. So that's simply what a dry well is.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mayor Piercy.
I had actually asked a question about the dry wells because I knew that the requirements had changed, that they had required that you deal with it, and then they changed the ruling, but you still felt that the need was there, so that was my understanding about that.
Yeah, as as I discussed, we're going through a process to do modeling right now, groundwater protectiveness modeling, but we don't have the answer yet. And once we go through that and then we overlay it with the maintenance needs and requirements for decommissioning some dry wells, we'll have a better idea of how that program will go forward.
Great.
But again, the near-term projects we've identified are high priority. in the
And
first
my only other
instance.
comment was a smart remark that I think the picture of City Hall that you put up there doesn't reflect the way it really looks today.
Look at Mike for that one.
And I think, Mike, that we have a better chance of people understanding the need for replacement if we had a different picture of it up there.
Right. Are you finished, Mayor Piercy? Is that it? Okay. So I put myself in the queue next, and one of my questions was on page 74 here in the CIP. It talks a little bit about the Eugene Parks Foundation. And so I was curious about what their role is in both developing our parks and maintaining them. I know that I've come across solicitations for help us build out a spray play area or that kind of thing. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how they interface with the city, how much support they provide, both on the capital side and then on the operations and maintenance side, if you know.
I think I'm going to bring Mark up for that one. He's
Okay,
the acting
great.
parks director.
Thanks.
I'll
give you the engineering perspective. They're primarily a fundraising organization that supports capital projects for the park. So their current project now is they're doing the fundraising, or one of the entities doing the fundraising for the skate park in Washington Jefferson. But that's their primary role. We have friends groups that support parks in terms of maintenance. So different friends groups will agree to maintain certain aspects of our park system as well. But they're separate from the foundation.
And how, do they raise a lot? Do they help a lot with these capital needs, or is it a sort of a small?
No, it's pretty substantial. I don't know the total dollar amount, and I'm trying to think of, I think it's one of the Washington Park spray play was one of their larger fundraising projects. So it's in the tens of thousands of dollars.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question. In relation to page 77 for Parks and Open Space land acquisition, it says the funding is identified, and that comes completely out of the parks SDCs is what it says. So the question is, are those SDC fees limited to acquiring only parkland within the city versus also being used to acquire parkland that's outside of the city?
I'll answer, and then I'll look to Kurt, and he can correct me. My recollection is that it is for both, that we've used it for properties both within and external to the city.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about the CIP presentation? Okay, yeah, Ken.
Kind of maybe a comment and a question. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this works.
That one, I'm not sure that one does either. You may need to try.
Let me get right up to it. All right.
That one sounds good. Yeah.
One of the interests I have when I came on the budget committee had to do with aging infrastructure, and I've had some conversations with staff about that, and was trying to go through that with that in mind, going through the plan. There's kind of a thread through this in various places where there are statements about maybe not having adequate funding for some of the preservation of various things, and it kind of flows through here various places. And I'm curious about a couple of things. It's really clear in here about the different funding sources, and I know one of the fund sources is transfers from the general fund, but then there are a lot of the SDCs and the bonds and so on. I'm generally curious about what kind of gaps there are, and I realize this kind of question probably isn't going to be answered in about 2 minutes, but gaps in funding, or how far we might be behind in some of these areas, like whether it's parks or roads or sewers or communication systems or whatever. And I'm curious about whether or not the SDCs, or as an example, or some of the other sources of funding are adequate over time to kind of keep up with that. I know, if you look at it nationally, that's kind of an emerging topic, aging infrastructure and taking care of it. So I guess it's kind of a question or kind of a concern I have about how you all are kind of looking at that kind of long term.
Well, I think a couple things. I think from the presentations you heard from Matt and Mike, the majority of the capital improvement program is focused on renovation and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure. And then the question that Councilor Brown asked in the reference to page 32, that a lot of those funding unidentified shows the unmet needs. So Matt had talked about just in the pavement preservation program, I think we're at 11 or 12 million annually, but a target to really fully maintain the existing street system is $18 million annually. So summing up that difference over the 6 years should be about what that identified number is on page 32.
Yeah, I guess my sense of it, there's a statement on page 10 talking about dedicated funds for some of these areas, and it says inadequate funding for preservation programs has resulted in a backlog of rehabilitation. And I'm So I guess I'm kind of curious, is your sense that we're kind of behind and maybe falling further behind, or are we keeping up, or, and that's...
Yeah, well, using the kind of the transportation system as an example is we're behind, but with the bond measures, we're not falling behind as quickly as we have in the past.
Okay.
But we're still not there in terms of fully, right.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
But I would also say, Ken, I think your general sense of things is true, that when we take a look across the board with infrastructures, that there's unfunded needs in whether it's transportation and our facilities pieces within our parks development, that we've had some conversations around how do we sustain that into the future, and some of that's just going to require sustainable funding sources. We've been focusing a lot on creating a stable budget, but eventually we also have to talk about a sustainable budget, which gets into some of those infrastructures that are not captured. One of the things I think Public Works does really well and Facilities does really well is try to maximize the dollars that are actually available and appropriated, and so they try to spend those at the right place to maximize the benefit to that particular piece of infrastructure, so it doesn't continue down the curve and cost us more later, but it's not enough to prevent all that from happening. So,
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, Mayor Piercy.
I just wanted to invite you to maybe staff could get you the materials from our Wednesday council meeting, because it really was a wonderful overview of the progress we've made on our road repairs. Yes, we have a lot more to go, but I always feel like you got to take a moment of celebration when you've made a major step forward at the same time. So I think that would be great for you all to get those materials from our Wednesday meeting.
I agree. I think that'd be very valuable for the whole committee to say thank you. I have one more question, if no one else is in the queue, and then we'll make sure it keeps open if anybody else does. But one of the questions I had was, for these projects where funding is not identified, how likely is it that funding is found? What is the percentage of those projects where funding's not identified, where some funding does come along within the 6-year period? And could you talk a little bit about that?
I'm trying to think of an example.
Either one.
It depends.
I figured that.
For some of the projects we show as with funding not identified, for instance, in transportation, we have a couple projects in there that are going through the application process for STIP funding, State Transportation Improvement Program funding. So we've identified a possible source of funding for those projects, and then we'll see how we compete. For others, for instance, the difference in the pavement preservation backlog, we don't have anything right now that's on the board.
And historically, has anything turned up or not usually?
I don't think that I could say one way or another.
The skate park project would be an example?
Yes.
Where
Where
there was SDC money, was that the source?
SDC money, and then donations are used for that. It'd be hard for me to say what the percentages or likelihood is, because it really depends on
the project.
The availability of grants for certain very specific projects and things like that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'll follow up with another question. And so as almost a more specific question or example of a project along the lines of what you were just mentioning, there's the project, it's on page 172. It has to do with the Amazon Active Transportation Corridor. And I understand that's one of the STIP projects that you were just referencing. So you're asking for roughly $1 million from the STIP to fund that with a match of $113,000. As part of approval of the CIP, is the City Council ultimately approving the spending of that $113,000 now as a match if that grant is awarded, or is there a subsequent process for that $113,000 to be actually approved or allocated once the grant's received.
It would be a separate budget appropriation.
Yeah. Separate appropriation.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Mayor Piercy has something to say.
Okay. Mayor Piercy.
We approved it as a priority, but we can't dictate what a future budget committee is gonna.
Absolutely, but I thought it was important. It's not like it just arrived there and we haven't talked about it as a council and made it and put it on the list. So,
Thank you.
If I can speak kind of to that question, and I think when I first joined the budget committee, I was confused about why there's the list of unfunded projects as well, and I think, the skate park's an example where it didn't have funding, but it was, again, I used this word yesterday, I think, aspirational to have that project there, so by going through the process to put it into the CIP, when that funding did become available, it was there ready to be implemented. So I think that's kind of the idea of this planning process, that you put things in the queue that you may not be able to get to. They may not be high priorities, but they are priorities of some kind, and then they just kind of sit there until the opportunity comes forward.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. I think we will move to discussion.
Yep, how about a motion?
Okay, so we are now open for discussion. Any comments additional to the questions we were asking? Put your name in the queue.
I think that's kind of what we were doing.
We were questioning officially. Now we're discussing if that's different. So, okay, so if there's no addition, Marty, did you have?
I'll just move to approve it.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve the CIP. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? Otherwise, we will move to a vote.
Can I just clarify?
Sure.
Are we moving to recommend approval to the city council, right?
Correct.
Okay.
All right, all in favor of recommending the CIP to the city council, please vote aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, the motion passes. Thank you. And we are adjourned.